He wakes up in the middle of the night to find her pressed against him, her breath brushing his cheek, making his heart race. A sudden embrace in the pool and a kiss on a rainy night blur the lines they were never meant to cross. Knowing they shouldn't, yet unable to resist the undeniable pull, they slip deeper into a desire from which there's no return. You just need to subscribe and like to hear different stories every day. Jason McNeal had just graduated from college at the age of 22, stepping into adulthood. But life had thrown challenges his way far earlier. His parents had both died in a tragic accident when he was only 12 years old. From that moment, Emily Watson, his mother's closest friend, became his guardian. She was just 10 years older than him, but over the years, she had evolved into both a caretaker and the most significant person in his life. In the years following his parents' passing, Emily and Jason lived together in a small room barely large enough to fit a single bed. Their days were marked by quiet moments of shared meals and nights huddled together under one blanket, each finding solace in the other's presence. Emily became his rock, his protector, and constant companion. The bond between them grew so deep that even as Jason moved into his own place, he gave Emily a spare key. After graduation, Jason found a job and rented a modest studio apartment close to his office. Though he had started living independently, Emily continued to visit him regularly, as if her presence was still necessary to keep him grounded. Every time she visited, it felt like coming home. Her visits were filled with a sense of familiarity that made everything else in Jason's life seem distant. That night, the two shared drinks, perhaps more than they should have. Jason could only vaguely remember helping Emily to his bed and then collapsing beside her, the alcohol blurring the edges of reality. When he woke up at 3:30 in the morning, the room was dim, illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was then that he realized something unusual. He wasn't alone in bed. His heart raced as he turned his head and found Emily lying next to him, her figure outlined delicately by the soft glow. Her face was mere inches from his, and every slow breath she exhaled seemed to brush gently across his skin. Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest, as though trying to leap out of his ribcage. His hand, almost acting on its own, reached toward her face. He wanted to trace her features, to run his fingers over the soft curve of her sleeping eyes. But halfway there, he froze and pulled his hand back. "What am I doing?" he thought, swallowing hard. "This is Emily, the woman who raised me." Trying to shake off his confusion, Jason carefully shifted, intending to get up and go to the bathroom. But just as he began to move, Emily stirred slightly in her sleep, her bare leg sliding over his abdomen, pinning him in place. The heat from her skin against his made him feel as though he were on fire, every nerve alive with sensation. Jason's breath hitched, and for a moment, he lay there, paralyzed. "I need to move. I need to get out of here." His mind screamed at him to act rationally, but the delicate friction of her leg against his skin was overwhelming, rendering him helpless. With trembling hands, he gently tried to lift her leg, only to have her unconsciously shift closer, seeking warmth in her sleep. The delicate touch of her body sent electric currents coursing through him, and it took every ounce of willpower not to give in to the emotions welling up inside him. Finally, Jason managed to slide out from under her without waking her. He covered Emily with the quilt, making sure she was warm, and slipped quietly into the bathroom. The cool water on his face helped clear his head, but his reflection in the mirror was a reminder of how dangerously close he had come to crossing a line he didn't fully understand. When Jason returned to the room, Emily was already awake, sitting up slightly, her tousled hair falling over her shoulders. "You're awake too," she said softly, her voice husky from sleep. "Yeah," Jason replied awkwardly, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll grab you some clothes if you want to change." Emily smiled lazily, stretching. "Thanks, but I think I'll shower first." She stood and made her way toward the bathroom, her black satin slip clinging loosely to her slender frame. The door clicked shut behind her, and Jason let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Through the frosted glass of the bathroom door, the silhouette of Emily's body was faintly visible. Jason's eyes were drawn to the blurry outline, and he found himself unable to look away. It wasn't intentional. He felt like he was trapped in a strange, dreamlike state where time moved slowly and every breath was laden with tension. He heard the water stop, and a soft sound escaped Emily's lips, a sigh of contentment. Moments later, the bathroom light flicked off, and Emily opened the door a crack. "Jason," she called out softly, "I didn't bring a change of clothes." Do you have something I can borrow? Oh, yeah. Hang on a sec. Jason rummaged through his closet, pulling out a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. He handed them to her through the narrow gap in the door, careful not to let their fingers touch. When Emily emerged a few minutes later, dressed in his oversized clothes, Jason's heart skipped a beat. The way the loose fabric hung off her slender frame made her look even more fragile, and there was a faint blush on her cheeks as she glanced at him briefly before slipping under the quilt again. Jason hesitated by the bed, torn between slipping in beside her or retreating to the couch. Emily looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You're sweaty," she murmured. "Go shower first, then come to bed." Jason stared at her, stunned. Was that an invitation? Did she really mean for him to join her in bed? His mind raced, struggling to interpret her words. But the warmth in her eyes and the way she smiled ever so slightly told him all he needed to know. This was the start of something he couldn't yet define, a delicate shift in the dynamics between them, a shift that left him both exhilarated and terrified. Jason stepped out of the shower, water dripping from his hair as he wrapped a towel around his waist. He glanced at the bed, where Emily lay curled beneath the quilt. Her eyes were closed, but there was something about the way she lay, her breathing too soft, her body too still, that told him she was awake. He dried off quickly, pulling on a t-shirt and shorts before slipping under the covers. The bed felt warm, but not from the blanket. It was the warmth left by her, radiating from where she lay just inches away. Jason stayed at the edge of the bed, rigid and tense, trying to convince himself that this was still normal, just two people sharing space, like they always had. Then, he felt it, a gentle nudge against his back. "Why are you so far away?" Emily whispered, her voice soft but insistent. Jason's breath caught in his throat. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." Emily made a small, frustrated sound, shifting closer until her arm brushed against his. "Come here." Hesitant, Jason scooted toward the center of the bed, his heart pounding louder with each movement. As soon as he was within reach, Emily's hand slipped into his, her fingers cool against his skin. It wasn't much, just the simplest touch, but it sent sparks through him, igniting emotions he hadn't fully understood before. He turned his head to glance at her. Emily's eyes were already closed, her breathing steady, but she hadn't let go of his hand. Jason swallowed hard, lacing his fingers with hers. The gesture felt both innocent and intimate, like crossing a threshold he wasn't ready to name. In that moment, everything felt right. As long as she was beside him, the world could fall apart and he wouldn't care. The next morning, Jason woke to the sound of the bathroom door clicking shut and the low hum of a hairdryer. He blinked at the sunlight streaming through the window, still half dazed from sleep. He lay there, trying to piece together the events of the night before. Emily had held his hand. She hadn't let go, not even when they both drifted off. And now, she was here, drying her clothes as if nothing had happened. When she emerged, her smile was easy and familiar, as if they were back to their old selves. Jason felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Part of him wanted to believe that everything was still the same, but another part of him knew that something had shifted. Over breakfast, Emily watched him carefully, her gaze lingering a moment too long. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Jason hesitated, poking at his food with his fork. "I was just thinking about last night." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "I mean, it felt different." She smiled softly, tilting her head. "We've been through a lot together, haven't we?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, a lot." That evening, Emily returned to Jason's apartment with a small suitcase in hand. Jason opened the door, surprise flashing across his face. "You're moving in?" Emily laughed, brushing past him. "No, just staying for a few days." "Miss me already?" Jason tried to play it off, but the truth was, he had missed her. There was a strange comfort in her presence, a familiarity that made him feel like he belonged. "You've been eating noodles all day, haven't you?" Emily asked, frowning as she peeked into his kitchen. "Only 2 meals," Jason mumbled, feeling slightly guilty. Emily shook her head in mock disapproval. "You need to take better care of yourself, Jason. I won't always be around to babysit you." Later that night, they decided to go out for dinner. Walking through the nearby shopping complex, Jason felt a rare sense of contentment. It wasn't the food or the company, it was the simple joy of being with someone who knew him better than anyone else. As they wandered the streets, the conversation flowed easily. They laughed, reminisced about old times, and talked about nothing in particular. Neither of them seemed eager to return to the apartment, as if staying out a little longer might keep reality at bay. When they passed by a movie theater, Emily perked up. "Oh, look. They're showing Titanic the remastered version." Jason blinked. "You've seen that, right? It came out before I was even born." Emily grinned. "Of course. But it's been ages. Come on, let's watch it." Jason bought the tickets, and to his surprise, Emily chose seats in the back corner of the theater. As the film began, the familiar opening scenes filled the screen, but Jason found it hard to focus on the movie. He could feel Emily's presence beside him, the brush of her arm, the warmth of her shoulder against his. Every subtle shift in her body felt magnified, like gravity was pulling him closer to her. Then came the infamous scene where Jack sketches Rose in the nude. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the tension rise between them. "This part's been cut," Emily muttered, her tone laced with annoyance. Jason glanced at her, amused. "You sound disappointed." Emily smirked, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "I am. They didn't censor it when I saw it in theaters the first time." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "You're full of surprises." As the movie progressed, Emily leaned her head on Jason's shoulder, her hand slipping into his once more. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. In the dim light of the theater, with the sound of the movie playing in the background, the boundaries between them blurred further. Jason didn't know where this was headed, but he knew one thing for certain: he didn't want to let go. "Now that you have come this far, don't worry. The most exciting part of the novel begins." Hair days drifted by, and Jason found himself slipping deeper into this strange, undefined connection with Emily. Every touch between them, every shared glance, felt loaded with meaning, but neither dared to name what was happening. Emily continued to stay at his apartment, her suitcase neatly tucked away in the corner, as if to say, "This is temporary but not really." She moved with the ease of someone who had lived there for years, and Jason found that he liked it. He liked coming home to find her curled up on his couch, liked how she fussed over what he ate, liked the way she filled the space that once felt empty. Yet, with every day that passed, the tension between them grew thicker, like the air before a thunderstorm. One sweltering summer afternoon, Emily stretched lazily on the couch, dressed in a light tank top and shorts. Her hair was tied in a loose ponytail, and she looked effortlessly beautiful. Jason was at the kitchen counter, stirring iced tea, and trying very hard not to notice how the curve of her legs caught the sunlight just so. "Jason," Emily called from the couch, her voice carrying a playful lilt. "I've been thinking, how about you take me swimming?" Jason turned, blinking. "Swimming?" Emily nodded, holding up a new one-piece swimsuit she had pulled from her suitcase. "I bought this just for you to see." "So, what do you think?" Jason's mouth went dry. It looks good. Really good." Emily grinned, clearly pleased with his reaction. "Perfect. Then let's go." They arrived at the pool not long after. Jason changed quickly in the men's locker room, emerging to find the pool almost deserted, just a few people here and there. The water glistened invitingly under the summer sun, kept at just the right temperature. When Emily appeared from the women's locker room, Jason's heart skipped a beat. Though her swimsuit was modest, a one-piece, it left just enough skin exposed to send his mind spinning. The straps crisscrossed her back, and the fabric hugged her curves in ways that felt almost too perfect. Jason quickly looked away, trying to act casual. But when Emily climbed down the pool ladder, the sight of her lithe form slipping into the water made it hard to breathe. The water was deeper than Emily had expected. With a small yelp, she missed her footing, her body plunging into the cool depths. Jason reacted instantly, swimming to her side and grabbing her hand. Emily's arms latched around his shoulders, and before he knew it, her legs instinctively wrapped around his waist for balance. The sensation of her wet skin against his was overwhelming. Her eyes widened in slight embarrassment as she realized how close they were. "I'm sorry," she whispered breathlessly, her face inches from his. Jason shook his head, swallowing hard. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine, not at all. Every part of him was hyper-aware of her, the softness of her body, the warmth of her breath on his neck. For a moment, neither of them moved, suspended in the water and in the weight of unspoken emotions. Emily loosened her grip, her legs slowly sliding away from his waist. But Jason could still feel the ghost of her touch, lingering like a spark that refused to go out. Let's try swimming again, Emily suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, leading her toward the shallower end of the pool, where they practiced floating and basic strokes. But every time Emily faltered, she clung to him like a lifeline, and each touch left him reeling. After a while, Emily tired, resting on the edge of the pool, while Jason swam a few more laps to clear his head. But as he finished his last lap, he looked up to see a man standing next to Emily, leaning in far too close for Jason's liking. Without thinking, Jason hauled himself out of the water and walked straight toward them. "Hey Mom," he called casually, draping an arm around Emily's shoulder. The man blinked in confusion. "Mom? She doesn't look old enough," Jason smiled tightly. "Yeah, well, she is. So, unless you're looking to get grounded, I'd back off." The man gave an awkward chuckle and quickly walked away. Emily turned to Jason, raising an eyebrow. "Really? Mom? That's your tactic?" Jason shrugged, struggling to hide his grin. "Worked, didn't it?" Emily rolled her eyes, though there was an unmistakable softness in her expression. "You're impossible." They left the pool not long after, the mood between them light and playful. But as they walked back to Jason's apartment, holding hands without even realizing it, Jason couldn't help but feel that something had changed. At the door, Emily hesitated. "Jason?" "Yeah," she smiled, but there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Thanks for today." Jason squeezed her hand gently. "Anytime." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. And then, without another word, Emily leaned up and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. Jason's heart stuttered. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Emily smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief, and disappeared into the apartment, leaving Jason standing there, stunned and breathless. The days continued to pass in a blur, each one pulling Jason and Emily closer to a line neither of them dared to cross, but both seemed intent on approaching. Their interactions, once casual and familial, now simmered with a tension that Jason couldn't quite name. Emily had become a constant presence in his apartment. Jason had grown used to the way she filled his space with her things, her scent, and her warmth. But every time she smiled at him just a bit too long or brushed against him in passing, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. One quiet evening, they decided to stay in and order takeout. They sat side by side on the couch, a movie playing in the background. Jason wasn't paying attention to the film, his focus was entirely on Emily, who leaned comfortably against his shoulder, their bodies pressed together. Halfway through the movie, Emily sighed. "Do you ever wonder," she murmured, "how life would be different if things had happened another way?" Jason blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" Emily gave a small, wistful smile. "If your parents hadn't. Well, if things hadn't gone the way they did. If I didn't have to step in." Jason frowned, unsure how to respond. "I never thought about it. You were always there for me. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her hand found his, fingers lacing together naturally. "I'm glad you feel that way," she whispered. Jason's heart raced, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. He could feel her pulse through their joined hands, and it was the only thing grounding him. That night, as they prepared for bed, Emily hesitated by the doorway. Jason looked up, meeting her gaze, and in that moment, everything hung in the balance. Emily started, then stopped herself. She exhaled a soft laugh, as if amused by her own hesitation. "It's nothing. Never mind." Jason watched as she slipped under the covers, her back turned to him. He climbed in beside her, lying stiffly on the edge of the bed. But before he could drift off, Emily shifted, rolling over to face him. "Jason," she whispered. His breath caught. "Yeah." Emily hesitated only a moment before reaching for his hand under the covers. "Do you ever think about us?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Emily gave a soft, nervous laugh. "I mean, do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different between us?" Jason swallowed hard. "All the time," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Emily's gaze softened, and she inched closer, her hand still holding his. "Me too," she whispered. The next morning, Jason woke to find Emily already up, sipping coffee by the window. She seemed lost in thought, her expression unreadable. "Morning," Jason said, his voice still groggy with sleep. Emily glanced at him, offering a small smile. "Morning." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the previous night lingering between them like an unspoken secret. "Do you have plans today?" Emily asked after a while, her tone casual. Jason shook his head. "Not really." "Good." Emily stood, stretching lazily. "How about we go out again? Do something fun?" Jason smiled. "Sure. What do you have in mind?" Emily grinned, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You'll see." They spent the afternoon wandering around the city, visiting random shops and stopping for ice cream at a small cafe. At one point, they stumbled upon a park, and without thinking, Emily grabbed Jason's hand, pulling him toward the swings. "You're such a kid," Jason teased, laughing as she hopped onto a swing and kicked off the ground. Emily grinned, her hair flying behind her. Life's too short to be serious all the time. Jason couldn't help but smile as he watched her, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time in a long while, everything felt simple easy. That night, they found themselves back at the movie theater, this time sitting in the same corner seats as before. The film was different, but the atmosphere was the same, dark, quiet, and filled with unspoken possibilities. As the movie progressed, Jason felt Emily's hand slip into his once again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He squeezed her hand gently, letting the warmth of her touch anchor him. When the credits rolled, neither of them moved. They sat there in the dark theater, hands intertwined, as if leaving would shatter the fragile peace they had found. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Jason." "Yeah?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I don't want this to end." Jason's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "It doesn't have to," he whispered. Emily smiled softly, and for a moment, everything felt right. But Jason knew deep down that the line between them was growing thinner with each passing day. You have read so much. Don't forget to subscribe. And like the tension between Jason and Emily had grown unbearable, like a tightly wound coil on the verge of snapping. Each day spent together blurred the boundary between what they were and what they were becoming. Neither of them spoke openly about it, but every touch, every glance, every lingering moment screamed the truth that neither dared to say aloud. It was a rainy evening when it all came to a head. Jason sat by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass as Emily dried her hair in the bathroom. The apartment felt heavy with the storm outside and with the storm building between them. When Emily stepped out of the bathroom, her damp hair framing her face, Jason's breath caught in his throat. She wore one of his t-shirts, loose and oversized, the hem brushing her thighs. "You okay?" she asked softly, noticing the distant look in his eyes. Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking." Emily crossed the room, sitting down beside him on the bed. "About what?" Jason hesitated, his heart pounding. "About us." Emily's expression shifted, softened. "Me too," she whispered. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken desires. Jason could feel the weight of her presence beside him, the warmth radiating from her skin. And then, as if pulled by some unseen force, Emily reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. That simple touch shattered the last of Jason's resolve. Before he could stop himself, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. For a moment, Emily froze. But then she melted into him, her hands sliding up his arms as she kissed him back with a tenderness that made Jason's head spin. The kiss deepened, slow and uncertain at first, as if they were both testing the waters of something they could never take back. Jason's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and Emily let out a soft sigh that sent shivers down his spine. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Emily's forehead rested against Jason's, her eyes half closed. "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. Jason smiled faintly. "But we are." Emily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Jason's hand slid along her back, tracing small, reassuring circles. "I know." For a moment, they just held each other, the world outside forgotten. The rain drummed against the windows, but inside, everything was still calm. The days that followed felt surreal, as if they were living in a dream they didn't want to wake from. They fell into an easy rhythm, stolen kisses in the morning, quiet conversations at night, and touches that spoke louder than words. They knew they were walking a fine line, but neither of them seemed to care anymore. What mattered was that they were together, that they had found something that felt right, even if the rest of the world would never understand. One night, as they lay together beneath the covers, Emily traced lazy patterns on Jason's chest. "Do you ever wonder how people would react if they knew?" she asked quietly. Jason smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I don't care what anyone else thinks." Emily's fingers stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle movements. "Me neither." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Jason stirred, blinking awake to find Emily still asleep beside him, her face serene in the soft light. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt at peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, they had found something real, something worth holding on to. He smiled, brushing a kiss against Emily's temple as she stirred slightly in her sleep. "Morning," she murmured drowsily, her eyes fluttering open. "Morning," Jason whispered back, his heart full. They lay there for a while, wrapped in each other, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.